All right, welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament lectionary podcast for preachers and teachers. My name is Paul S. I am a PhD student at Yale University.
And I'm Rosie Candlepole, Assistant Professor of Hebrew Bible at Wake Forest University. And hey, we're back with regular full-length episodes. Those of you that have been listening faithfully over the summer probably took in some of our kind of 5 to 10 minute quick edits on the lectionary. But today, we are bringing you a full-length treatment of our first reading, which is Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 through 20. And that is the first reading from the RCL for Sunday, August 25th, 2025, the 14th Sunday after Pentecost. And hey, we've got almost Dr. Paul Essa here. There, Paul, would you like to take us?
Almost Dr. S.I. is like, it's a good title. I'll take it. I'll take that.
He's just there. Almost there.
Yeah, you're right, Rosie. I think this is a really familiar passage, and I have a particular struggle with familiar passages because I tend to try to look for something new to say, which is always not a good thing to do. And so with familiar passages, it's like, it's crazy difficult to do that.
I'm sure preachers have the same challenge, right?
Yeah,
I mean, going back around over the same passages. Let's see if we can help them.
Perhaps the good thing about this passage is it's the pairing with the gospel reading, right? With the Luke 14 reading. And I think it does strike a really natural conversation and providing different, wild but interesting feedbacks on or perspectives on what life means. And how human actions and inactions sort of interact with this whole concept of the good life. So you would realize that in Deuteronomy, there's this understanding that the good life is to be chosen, or it can be chosen. And Jesus responds in a slightly different way in the Luke passage. And I won't get so much ahead of myself, but the Deuteronomy passage is where Moses is before the people and is giving them this like two blatant options: choose life, and there's also the option for you to choose death, right? But I am encouraging you, Moses, to choose life. And Jesus seems to be responding in a slightly different way by saying, when you lose your life or when you give up your life, you actually gain it back in a somewhat implicit way. So I feel like there's an interesting conversation here to be had, and that's why I feel like I'm going to be going for the rest of the episode.
Oh, great. Yeah, so let's talk about this, right? Because one thing, maybe just as background too for Deuteronomy, right? Just the kind of basic, it's the second law. So, kind of the summation of Moses' life and career as a prophet, teacher, priest, everything, judge to these people, right? And so these are his final words to the people of warning, as you said, of choosing life and avoiding death, right? So there's a kind of hindsight to Deuteronomy chapter 30, right? That we kind of have to go in knowing that this is, and it's not in the moment. And that might give us a perspective on this theme that you're offering to us, which is choosing life, right? There's a different kind of way to interpret a choice after it's been made. And I wonder, what you make of that here.
Yeah. I have a lot of questions about, what kind of choice is it? Like, if you look at the narrative arc of the whole thing, these people are being presented a choice at a unique period. This is after 400 years of enslavement, after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, after all these, communal instability, all these deep traumatic things happening over the period. And then before them is being presented this option, you are about to approach this new land filled with other people, different cultures, different gods, different practices. Already they have been prepared to stay very much far away from these practices. And then the options come. Choose life, right? So there's a lot of questions to be asked about what does choice as a practice mean for people like this? Do they even have the ability to choose life, right? And then also, would anybody intentionally choose death? By intention, actively choose death? Really? Would they, if the options are that plain, right? And so, there's something to be talked about here about the invitation itself. And it's been, particularly for me, it's important because this particular passage has been used as a proof text to sort of go back on the usual, perfect decisions in your life will be kind of fine, that kind of sermon lining of things in popular imagination. And I don't think that the text deserves that kind of thing, right? Because for me, choice is a lot more complicated than that. Moreover, this is also the question of what exactly counts as life, right? On that other side of the Jordan, they are about to set in the land. It's going to be a lot of fights, as we know in Joshua, and it's going to go on throughout, like even some parts of the book of Samuel. So is Moses offering them a promise or a warning, right? What is actually about to happen? And perhaps for me, more importantly, is, as I have alluded to early on, is the capacity to choose, right? Well, what does it mean to choose life when your thoughts and all of your worldviews have been deeply, deeply impacted by systems that resonate on freedom or scarcity or generational harm or trauma? Can you really see life? And can you really be able to choose it, right? And speaking as somebody who's studies and focuses on colonial communities and colonial spaces, and the kinds of things that happen in those spaces. Sometimes when you have been impacted by so much harm, it's really difficult to be able to set yourself free, to choose freedom, right? Theologically, I think that the offer that Moses is giving is real. I don't think that God is trying to trick them. There is some genuineness about the desires of God here. At least I can assume that. But existentially, I think that choice seems to be constrained in this particular passage, where the option of life and death not laid out in a neutral way before them. It is coming with all these histories and memory and power dynamics and all these things that make it slightly tough. So that's my little problematizing of this whole presentation of it. And everything that I'm saying really is essentially will count as a pitfall for preachers that just be warned, it's not that simple. Make good decisions in your life will be good. It's a lot more complex than that.
I think you and I were talking about how, as you said, right, nobody purposefully chooses death, right? That's part of the conceit of this passage, right? Is that that people are deliberately choosing death, but that often isn't the case. When we make choices, we think certain choices are going to bring us greater life. And it's only in hindsight that we recognize that, in fact, that choice did not bring greater life or freedom for us. It in some way returned us to bondage, to slavery, or to less life than what might have been possible if we had made a different choice, right? So just recognizing for our congregations that, no one does that on purpose. And if we even look back on our own lives, we can see perhaps where there was a better choice to be made. And yet life moves forward, right? So we are not God. We do not know what comes forward. We make the best choices we can with the options that we have. But as you said, this is a kind of wealth, right? A kind of privilege.
It is.
The number of choices and options we have are a part and parcel of the lot in life that we've been dealt, right? So one thing you may be helping preachers to understand is not everyone has the same access to life or life-giving choices, and that's an important thing to acknowledge. And there may be times in our lives where we're better able to see those options than others, right? So, and I think the gospel passage actually does a lot to illuminate that, right? Yeah, because you've really talked about the irony of Jesus saying, you can love life and choose life, but ultimately, if you do not lose it, ultimately you are going to lose it, right? We're going to die. And the harder you grasp life, the more likely you will to lose the quality of your life, right? And so there's a real paradox that both Moses and Jesus are doing in this curated conversation that you're creating between Jesus and Moses on this topic of life, right? The other part of the gospel passage that I maybe would like to ask you about is the parable that Jesus offers, right? Which he kind of offers this idea of a king who is waging some sort of military campaign or wants to build a tower. And the lesson there is the king needs to count the cost, right? How much will it cost to build this tower? How much will it cost to do this military campaign? If he doesn't number his resources properly, he will need to sue for peace while the enemy is approaching, because there's a window of opportunity there. But if he makes the estimate incorrectly and thinks that he has the ability to wage a war and then loses, right, there's a greater loss. So at the end of this passage, Jesus says, so therefore none of you can become my disciples if you don't give up all your possessions. So I wonder how do you bring these things together in this conversation about life? What does this parable about this would-be king give us?
I think the first half of the parable resonates for the most part the sort of paradigm that Moses also offers to the people, right? Essentially, there's consequence to you not being intentional about the choices that you make, right? And also that there is benefits to making an intentional choice. But where I think like the disruption comes is when Jesus comes in, right? When we get to 26, when Jesus is like giving up your life, it is actually like loss is actually a way of finding back that life, right? Which is a more specific kind of choice, in that it is similar to like the sort of good life that I think Moses is presenting to the people.
Yes.
And in that case, Jesus is like sort of problematizing in a similar way that I am also problematizing Moses' is sort of blunt presentation of what the consequences of choices are. Yeah. In that life is not found through this sort of straightforward moral curation of life or curation of our own like decisions, but there's wisdom in surrendering it, in letting it go, right? Which I think is sort of jarring. Basically, Jesus is saying that there's wisdom in there, and that letting your life go and choosing the cross is like a pathway to becoming part of the kingdom that he is making, or part of the disciples that he is building. And that's like the sort of language that he chooses there. Perhaps I'm even getting more into the paradox of it. Like Jesus actually complicating the paradox even more, right? Without necessarily offering the options. And I think, I agree with you. I don't have a clear sense, but I do feel like this is it's in between these paradoxes and the complication of what it means to choose and where that leads us. I feel like that's where the sermon for this week lies. I feel like that's where the preaching tip is at. And I do think that Moses and Jesus have something to say to each other. More so, Jesus have something to say to Moses. Like you gain life by actually losing it and choosing the cross and choosing death and choosing, your own lack of access.
One thing you're helping me to see anew is, so just as you talked about Deuteronomy and Moses and that final sermon is not a transcription in live time. It is, right. It is something that's being given in hindsight, right? To help people to be able to understand that generation and even to take warning, right? So that for future generations, as they read Deuteronomy, they're able to make sense of the past in a certain way. It's often, as you said, a cudgel, a judgment, an instrument to say that generation went the wrong way. They chose death. And that's the consequence, right? So there's a hindsight. But this passage in Luke, as you're talking about the cost of discipleship, the laying down of your life in order to take hold of it, this message helps us understand the cross in a new way. For the disciples, I mean, again, Jesus' words are not being transcribed in the way that maybe many of our congregations might think Scripture is, sort of a literal maybe writing down of the red letters or something like that.
Yeah.
It is in hindsight that the disciples are putting together the words of Jesus with the like mystifying events of his life, including the cross, so the major stumbling block for many of these early believers who are trying to understand how could someone voluntarily surrender themselves to the state, right?
Exactly,
Someone turn themselves in for a crime they didn't commit and be crucified, for all to hurl insults at, to be humiliated, to be remembered as a criminal. Well, this passage helps reinterpret that event, right? So the disciples are remembering this and bringing it forward for future generations as they look back at the cross to say, unless you've lost your life, unless you're willing to carry the same cross that Jesus carries, you cannot become a disciple. And that is a really, Luke and this gospel has a lot of effort in trying to help its readers to be able to understand this primary mystery of Jesus's death. How do we get around this? How do we teach people that this is the way?
Yeah.
It's the only way that we have to lose life to gain it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the radicality of it is also the counterculturalness of it. Like it's not a thing that normal people do. The Jesus kind of people who do that, right? It's not a thing that normal people would do. And so to actually put in a literal way, put life in loss, it's really sort of like counter-cultural, but also like counter our normal imaginations of how you actually gain things. And that's where the beauty is.
Right. I think that's a wonderful way to maybe approach this, even, for preachers to be thinking about, like, how do these texts help us understand discipleship or help us understand forerunners in faith as well, right? So our ancestors are examples of this, right? As we think about the people that have lived the most successfully, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a scriptural standard, a biblical standard for this of what it means to be successful. And then there is what we know from living life, like on the standards of success, right? So Jesus and Moses are both flipping some of this upside down, right? That life is not about possessions. Life is not about riches and wealth. In fact, those things will pass from you. Make your surrender now. Sue for terms of peace now, right? And receive mercy, right? And it's only in surrendering that you win your campaign. There's a real paradox in the gospel passage by offering that within this sort of, rather than taking the binary, of just saying,
rather than taking the binary of Moses, right?
Right? Yeah, it's a really much more nuanced presentation when you put Moses and Jesus together in this lectionary combination. That there's real riches that you've uncovered, hopefully.
That's right, and I think those are the two things that I would offer for preachers to really think seriously about the sort of implicit dialogue between Moses and Jesus here, and the reordering of our own social attachments and connections. Like, Jesus didn't just mention life; it's just like mother, father, children, wife, brothers, sisters. Like, give up on all of those things. And that's how you become a disciple. That's how you choose life. That's how you become a disciple. And so the sort of the radicality of it, which we've mentioned, but also the implicit paradox. And I think that there's the good conversation there to be had. And perhaps the other one is if you preachers are going to stay to Moses, then I would be cautious of the binary questions, like who gets to choose, what counts as real choice, questions of pressure and political dynamics and power dynamics and social, psychological, historical forces that shape decision-making for people that have been stuck for a very long time. So thinking about those things, I believe, help your reading of Moses' presentation.
Well, Paul, I think that sounds like a pretty good place to leave things, right? Thank you so much for preparing this conversation and helping us see Jesus and Moses in dialogue in the lectionary readings.
Thank you so much.
Well, I think we're going to call it an episode here. And if you're new here, we want you to check out our past episodes on just about every lectionary passage in existence on firstreadingpodcast.com. Please come check us out. And if this episode helped your preaching prep or your teaching, please do pass us on to a friend. Recommend us, leave us a review on Facebook or on any other place that you find your podcasts. Until next time, I'm Rosie Candifal.
And I'm Paul Essa. Have a wonderful week preaching.